As we move into the 18th century or the 1700s, things continue to change dramatically. Things are changing dramatically, and the colonies, and especially the major cities within the colonies, are becoming much more established. You see amazing growth during the 1700s. From 1700 to 1750, the population increased from 250,000 people in the entirety of the colonies to over 2 million. As I mentioned, many of these were immigrants, most of them living and moving into the back country. Um, Many of them were not um, British, and you had the Scotch Irish that were often persecuted back in England, and they flee just like the Puritans did across the ocean for safety and for opportunity. The Scotch Irish generally settled in the Pennsylvania area, the Shenandoah Valley. Uh, they were considered by most to be obstinate, disruptive, not easily taking rules, not liking to be told what to do. The Germans, many of the Scotch Irish, let's go back to them, they were poor. Many of them were fleeing poverty. The Germans, on the other hand, they generally came over much like the early New England settlers. They were nuclear families. They were already relatively well established and middle class, and they settled early on in parts of Pennsylvania. And they oftentimes tried to isolate themselves, just as they did later in the 1800s when they came to Texas and established their own communities in Texas. They kind of insulated themselves. They wanted to preserve their customs and preserve their Germanness. Uh, as these colonies were growing, the British saw it as an opportunity to get rid of some of their ne'er do wells and the people they did not like and they did not want over in England, and so they began shipping convicts over to settle in in the colonies. And of course, the colonists, once they realized what was happening, they did not like this at all, and they threw a fit in Parliament. But for quite a few years, the British would just send their convicts, instead of housing them in prisons in England, they would just send them to the colonies. And then, with all this going on, all this immigration, this flood of people coming in from Europe, you still have the Native Americans. They, of course, were there when Jamestown and Plymouth were established, and they have been constantly pushed inward into the middle of the country towards the Appalachian region, towards what's called the Appalachian Mountains, which is kind of the mountain ridge that it's the natural barrier of between the coastal states and the coastal areas and what's called the frontier, or the Ohio Valley, what would be later called the Ohio Valley. But they have to stake out this middle ground. They have to survive, and they have to play all these different factions against each other. So they moved across the Appalachian Mountains into this area that is, now we would know it as Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio, where there was no colonial power. There was no established colonial power. Now, alternately, the French and the Spanish claimed that area. They claimed that land on the deeper into the what will be the Americas, deeper into what will be later to be the United States. But there was no governments there. There was nothing established there to to rule. So the natives basically staked their ground out there. Um, and as they did this, multiple Indian nations kind of bonded together, because there's many different Indian nations in 1492 when the initial uh, European invasion happened. Uh, but as they moved westward, they had to kind of combine their sources and combine their resources, and many of the different nations uh, got together and formed new, two or three nations, Indian nations might get together and form one new Indian nation. As you can see, here's a map of the different uh, groups, settling groups that came over and were the dominant immigrant groups of the areas. You can see up in the New England area, they're English. That's you know, the English up there, and then down in North Carolina. Then the Dutch up around New York. Remember, New York was initially a Dutch settlement. Africans in the Deep South. in South Carolina along the coast, more Africans than any other population. Then you had your Germans out in parts of Pennsylvania, and then the Scotch Irish. They are the ones that are farthest inland towards the Appalachian Mountains. And if you can see that red line that runs from Upper Maine all the way down to Georgia, that's basically the ridge of the Appalachian Mountains, or pretty close to it, or maybe just on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains. But that's that natural barrier that the native tribes had crossed over into to kind of escape the nonstop immigration of settlers. And of course, you see the different tribes there. You have the Algonquin, the Iroquois, the Susquehannock, sorry, the Miami, the Shawnee, the Chickasaw, and on and on. And these tribes, basically were just forced to continuously move to accommodate, move or die to accommodate the just insatiable greed for land of the British settlers, or the colonial settlers, not just British anymore, but as you see, Scots, Irish, German, Dutch. Uh, Other territories that were being explored and exploited were during this time in what is now America, the Spanish borderlands in the 1700s or the 18th century. The Spanish controlled the area north of Mexico, what is now Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado. Uh, and while they controlled them, they met a lot of resistance, just like the British did. The 16th, 17th century Spanish settlements, they had to fight for their survival. Uh, there was very little secured military or political control, while the British and their settlements quickly established both military and political control with militias and governments. That same thing did not happen in the Spanish settlements. They were basically just there for little there were Spanish missions to try to convert the Indians to Christianity, but there were very few just established settlements where that became permanent, where people lived, that they could protect themselves. But there were some minor settlements and some major settlements. Places like what now is San Antonio was an early Spanish settlement, but it did not grow quickly and establish itself in the Spanish borderlands. The Spain did not, like England did in the along the Atlantic coast. But Spanish culture did persist, especially architecture and language. Uh, uh, we today in this part of the world, in Texas and New Mexico, have great Spanish influence in our names of our rivers, names of our towns, in our languages. Indians living under Spanish rule suffered economic discrimination, but not to the extent that, say, Africans did in the British colonies. They had basically economic discrimination meant they couldn't have certain jobs, but they were not segregated in society. They were not, you know, the laws, besides just different laws with regard to the kind of jobs they could have, the laws applied equally to the Indians for the most part in the Spanish settlements. Here's just a map of what was called the Spanish borderlands and the areas that were controlled and explored by Spain, and those are the Indian tribes that existed within those territories. And of course, you can see the dotted lines outline what are now current states. Um, of course, because the colonies traded so often and with with Europe, many of the ideas and the culture of Europe came over and kind of infiltrated the American way of life, the colonial way of life. Especially, it began to have an effect on the Puritan way of life, because the Puritans lived this pure life, or they attempted to early on, and it became corrupted in a lot of ways by the ideas of Europe. Urban areas developed along the seaboard. These big cities became cultural centers. Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Newport, and Charleston. There was extensive commercial contact with British. They were constantly trading with them, trading goods, ideas, books, sharing. The colonies copied the fashions and the architecture of what was popular in in Europe. Also, during this time, you had what was called the American Enlightenment. Of course, if you know the earliest Enlightenment, you should know was about you know it was a philosophical and intellectual revolution that kind of tossed aside the backward thinking and the the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages of the where and all this really began with the invention of the printing press, which spread knowledge and the ability to read and the ability of people to think for themselves. But it was a scientific revolution. People began to think in terms of reason and logic instead of just strict theology and church doctrine. And so this happened earlier in the 15 and 1600s in Europe, but beginning in the 1700s, it kind of reinvented itself in the Americas. Now it was less radical than in Europe and more practical. They used the Enlightenment ideas for for inventions and things like that. It was more of a political Enlightenment in Europe, where you saw the overthrow of churches and the challenging of a church authority. Although that did happen in the Americas too. Many of the Enlightenment thinkers of Europe were just flat out atheists, whereas in America that wasn't necessarily the truth. The Enlightenment thinkers were often religious; they just weren't as religiously extreme. People like Franklin and Jefferson, they were what we call deists, who believed that there was a supreme being, but that supreme being did control everything. Just treated um, he just kind of created the universe and let it go and let it just kind of run itself like a machine. And it was that was a direct challenge to the existing some of the church authorities that existed at the time, because many of those churches believed that God controlled everything, and they taught their congregation and their followers that God controlled everything. And the American Enlightenment kind of argued against that. Most of the founders did not believe that. Most of the founders were deists who believed that kind of, you know, there was a supreme being, but he didn't control day-to-day operations of the universe. Also, economic transformation. As demand increases, people are getting wealthy, but they want, as always, they want more money, and more people want to get wealthy, and they see the navigation acts and those regulations on trade. While they're not enforced all the time, they are enforced sometimes, and that is even too much for the British. I mean, for the colonists, the British regulating the trade, and so that resentment is going to begin to build against British interference in colonial trade. And of course, with all this money coming in, and all this trade, and all this exposure to fashion and architecture, we become a consumer society. We become a consumer society. We like to buy things. And of course, we are a consumer society to this day. We like to we like fine things in America. We like to have stuff. And this consumer society was driven by two things really. First, American demand, because we see stuff that we want, and second, by the English Industrial Revolution. England had the first industrial revolution long before the U.S. had theirs in the mid to late 1800s, and their industrial revolution was based in textiles, clothing and cloth, and they were able to produce it in mass quantities in textile mills, which was a radical transition from the basically making your own clothes in your home. And so when they were able to mass produce clothes, they would send them over to the United States. I'm sorry, not the United States, but the colonies, and sell them here. Um, but we began to create a consumer society. Also, during the 1700s, you see a religious revival happening. And this religious revival will be termed the Great Awakening. And it's basically a challenge against existing church authority. And it is also an avenue for those that are living out in the frontiers where there is not a lot of connection to society to kind of get religion, if you will. And it was began by a guy named George Whitefield, and he would travel around. He was what we call an itinerant preacher. I mean, he would just travel around and have these outdoor sermons, these outdoor sermons with tent revivals, I guess is what you would call them, that were large and they were emotional, and people got into it, and people just kind of they would just completely express themselves in a way that was not that was kind of frowned upon in traditional Puritan churches, where you had to be very silent and pious and quiet. These people, got the spirit, if you will, and so these outdoor sermons became very popular, and they began to challenge the existing church authority. They began to question, the doctrine of the existing churches, and they began to, pray and preach and enjoy their religion outside of the established churches. And this was a great, threat to church authority. Uh, Now, some revivalists, some of these Great Awakening preachers were anti-intellectuals. Of course, e- from the beginning of when religions first began to even today, there's always been this challenge, and like I said, it still exists today between religion and science, religion and intellectualism. Uh, because those that are read the Bible, they want to believe everything the Bible says, but if somebody produces scientific logic or reason that challenges that creates a tension, it creates a problem, and you either, some reject religion and go with the logic and the science, others reject the logic and science because they don't want to uh, uh, believe that their religion is wrong. Others kind of find a middle ground. Uh, Most in America, the American tradition is finding a middle ground, being religious but accepting, scientific truths. Uh, Most of these revivalists during the Great Awakening were trained ministers, and many of them, especially the wealthier ones and the successful ones, founded their own colleges. Colleges like Princeton, Dartmouth, Brown, Rutgers. They were all religious institutions, religious schools. Although they did not, they taught science, and they taught to be a well-rounded, informed individual, generally optimistic about the future, and they challenged and questioned established institutions. They challenged established church institutions, and they challenged and questioned established political institutions. This is all of these things, these challenges to authority back in Virginia with Bacon's Rebellion, the challenge to authority with the religious revivals, all of these things set up an American tradition of questioning authority and free political speech. And, of course, free religion, freedom of religion. Early on, the colonial settlers attempted to copy British institutions, but as they were left alone, especially in the early 1600s and up through the 1700s, it became clear that the colonists, or the Americans, whatever you want to call them, the colonists were different from the British. And because they were different, their institutions became different. Their norms became different. In England, especially our political system, in England, few people actually were represented in the British system. Very few people were able to vote, and it was very centralized in their authority, meaning all the power was basically in Parliament, and distant from the actual communities, whereas most colonial representatives were very local. You had your town halls, you had your local assemblies, your city councils. And so Americans demanded more representation than was traditional in Great Britain. Uh, Part of the problem, too, and also what made the representative councils or the democratic institutions of the colonists so successful and so powerful was the general incompetence of the appointed royal governors, because you had this kind of a conflict in political uh, desires. You had all these local communities who had their own city councils. You had colonial legislatures which were elected by the colonists. But then, above it all, with basically veto power, you had royal governors that were appointed by the king. And so you had tension between, the democratic process of the colonists and the monarchy represented by the royal governor. Uh, the colonial assemblies were beholden to the voting population. Most white men, but not all, could vote in the colonies. There were a lot of states that had property requirements that you had to have either had lived somewhere for an extended period of time or that you owned a certain amount of property before you could vote. But still, at that point, only white men could vote in all the colonies. Uh, of course, slaves or even free blacks couldn't vote. Indians could not vote. Um, Assemblies controlled the raising of revenue. This was a tradition that is going to be very important. That basically the assemblies and the representatives of the colonists taxed themselves. British did not directly tax the colonists, and they never had directly taxed the colonists. And the way the British made their money was through taxing imports and exports, tariffs, but they never directly taxed or raised revenue by by taxing the colonists. Uh, Indian interference by the royal governor led to major protests and the protests weren't worth the trouble. So the crown did not try to raise revenue by taxing the colonists. Uh, Many of the law courts, though, were based on British common law, uh, representing British customs in the law. And so all these things showed that while we had some traditions that we took from England that worked for us, many of our traditions were very different. Many of the established traditions that were formed in the colonies over these first couple of hundred years were very different than the British system. And while all this was happening, the establishment of the colonies, the expansion of the colonies, the Great Awakening, all these things, while this was happening, there was constant wars between the European empires, the European powers, specifically wars between the British and the French. There were four wars that were fought between the British and the French during the colonial periods. Um, Many of those wars, some of them were fought in North America by French and British subjects, and of course we're going to see the 7 Years' War will be one of those too. But there were attempts by England to take Canada from France. There was King William's and Queen Anne's wars between 1689 and 1713, which which was just an extended European war. You had King George's War, 1743 to 1748, with no real winners. But the French, while there was no victors, the French, and some of that fighting took place over here. The French began to build forts in Ohio Valley, which is that area across the Appalachian Mountains, to protect their interests. And so the French now have established a position in North America, in the Americas, and that's going to later on lead to bigger problems. Because of the threat of the French, and also because of the threat of Indians, uh, Benjamin Franklin organized something called the Albany Congress, which was an attempt to kind of organize the New England states into a larger government, to try to create maybe a government of New England to protect the interests of the different New England colonies, because they had very similar uh, interests. While they may have some subtle differences, they were all commercial ventures. They were all Protestant, and they all had the same kind of common culture. But this Albany Congress that was proposed, was frowned upon by the British government, and they would not allow it to happen. And so um, that didn't help. And then, though, the real dramatic change and the big pivot point, really, in the colonial history, and the event that will place the colonies on a path to independence, was something called the Seven Years' War, also called the French and Indian War. And it was a war that lasted between, of course, the British and the colonies versus the French aligned with the Indians between 1756 and 1763. It was a global war that will fundamentally shift the balance of power, not just between England and the French or Great Britain and the French in the colonies and in North America, but also it's going to create a rift between the colonists and Great Britain themselves. Just to get an idea of how the Americas looked about the time of the this French Indian War. This is a good map. The yellow area are British claims, which is all the British colonies along the the eastern seaboard there, and then of course the far northern part of Canada. French claims basically all the interior of what is now the United States, and all the way up into what is you see New France there, which is the eastern part of present day Canada. Then the Spanish, of course, had their major presence in the southern part of the continent, North America, and then into South America. And then if you look up around where Alaska is, you see Russia's claims. And while that seems minor at this point, in the future it will lead to some friction. But so you've got this big, huge side of the world that is being basically divided up, and it's that division is not going to last. Wars will be fought over it.